At first sight, it's hard to believe that this is in fact the historic city center of Monterrey, a city founded in 1596. The creation of the square required the demolition of 40 hectares of the historic downtown. But the square itself is now a vital part of the history and identity of Monterrey. This is the story of the MACROPLAZA, told through several lenses that attempt to reconceptualize the past and future of Monterrey City Square. Monterrey's history starts with the coming of the 17th century, when the city was established by Spanish and Portuguese families during the viceroyalty of the Nueva España. They settled around the Santa Lucia River and its waterholes, which were vital resources for them. For decades, the city saw little growth, and it was not until the US invasion of 1846 that the fate of Monterrey began to change. The loss of Mexican territory meant that Monterrey was now in much closer proximity to the border, which gave the city a strategic location for trade and manufacturing. From this moment onward, Monterrey saw an era of economic growth and expansion, with many companies establishing in the capital of Nuevo León. Fundidora, Cervecería Cuauhtémoc, Vitro, Cemex, and many other companies were born during this period. Not only did they create large campus-like facilities, they also developed housing projects for their workers, including schools, parks, and amenities, which shaped the city's expansion during the 20th century. Unlike the newly established neighborhoods of the 40s and 50s, the city center's constructions were typically low-rise and arranged around central patios, many of them made of ashlar masonry, which provided great thermal comfort. By the mid-20th century, this area functioned as a much-needed core for smaller traders and businesses, as well as an entertainment district with theaters, bars, and cinemas. This was a vibrant and busy area of town, as expressed by Mario Martínez Oseguera for a local newspaper piece. In 1979, Alfonso Martínez Domínguez enters the political stage as the state governor of Nuevo León. The role this individual took in the transformation of Monterrey's fabric and its socio-political climate cannot be underestimated. Martínez has recently left his short-lived position as chief governor of Mexico City, accused of ordering a paramilitary group to repress a protest where 225 young students were killed. After his resignation, he returned to Monterrey, where he was able to retake his political career with a reputation of being a man not to mess with. When the plan to build a gigantic square in the city center was announced during the 80s, newspapers cited that the idea had been going around since the 50s. Despite the rumors, Alfonso Martínez is the man that executed the project. A plaza that runs from palace to palace. This was his preferred catchphrase when explaining the plan to connect the state government palace to the municipal palace through the Great Plaza. In the eyes of Alfonso Martínez, the city center of Monterrey had not been able to cope with the growth of the city. It was to his liking, flat, grey, and ugly. However, more than 3 centuries of history had already shaped the city center, and was at the time home to more than 140 families and hundreds of businesses. It is not hard to imagine that they appeared to him as an unwanted sector of society, people that represented a past era, not compatible with the aspirations of the great metropolis of Nuevo León. The announcement of the Great Plaza came with the creation of ProUrbe, a decentralized state body meant to direct the project and provide neutrality, although ultimately still being a public entity. This body would also be in charge of managing the loan made by the private bank Banamex to guarantee that no taxpayer money would be used to build the square. Soon after, the country went into a severe economic crisis that resulted in the nationalization of banks. This series of events make it hard to determine whether the square's construction was in fact done under public and private coordination, although there was an evident effort to make it seem like this was the case. The project was described as a place for leisure with fountains, gardens, and cafes. The adjacent plots would be developed with mixed-use high-rises including shops, office spaces, and housing. This scheme would attract investors and tourism, making the project sustainable long-term. Demolitions were set in motion, and families began to be displaced to social housing neighborhoods on the outskirts of the city, approximately 10 kilometers away from the city center. But not everything went as planned, and the works for the square began to present changes. Due to the 1982 economic crisis, developers lost interest in Monterrey's downtown and found cheaper land further south into what today is one of the richest municipalities in all of Latin America. In a turn of events, the state government bought several plots that were meant to be sold to developers and constructed new buildings for the State Congress, National Institute of Social Housing, a public theater, a central library, and the Supreme Court of Justice, adding to the already existing Municipal Palace and State Government Palace. The project also included some spaces like an underground market and a state archive, which are now abandoned. The development of high-rises around the plaza never arrived, and compared to the more than 140 families that lived in this area, today only a handful of people inhabit the blocks around this square. Before going any further, it is worth visiting the origins of this square's name. It was first advertised as La Gran Plaza, but soon after, the people of Monterrey would start calling it the MACROPLAZA, a name that became official even before this square ever existed. The prefix macro can be used to describe something of large scale, but it can also imply a relation of the whole, as opposed to its individual parts. The idea of using a prefix to name the square seems interesting. Even if not deliberately, the Regios collectively suggest a way of framing the square as something to be viewed as a whole. So what is then a plaza or square? Dictionaries offer simple and broad definitions containing qualities like square-shaped and public land within a city, attributes which do not always apply. A town square, however, is closely related to the concept of power: economic, religious, political. In the end, the square becomes a paradox, as it provides the public with a platform to defy power, while at the same time being the physical representation of it. Squares are also a source of symbolism, often taking part in the construction of myths and stories of origin. By being empty voids in the urban fabric, they remain spaces of possibility. Going further, looking at other squares can provide a benchmark to compare its scale, representation of central power, civic unrest, and length of existence. From this perspective, the MACROPLAZA appears as young and of very large proportions, with a high representation of centralized government power and a relatively low presence of civil unrest. Nonetheless, this narrative is too reductive, as it only accounts for physical aspects of the squares and quantifies major specific events, while ignoring the everyday experience of these spaces and non-physical representations of power. This is perhaps a moment of realization that the MACROPLAZA accounts for much more than just its definition as a whole and from a top-down narration. It becomes evident that the lens under which this space is observed must change in order to comprehend how the square is lived and experienced.